I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, just minutes after Presidents Putin and Trump spoke over the phone, we react to the strategy being adopted by both sides. Is Putin playing Trump like a fiddle? Then, later, we hear about the worst aerial bombardment Ukraine has experienced of the entire war, which took place not 3 years ago, but on Sunday.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 19th of May, 3 years and 85 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Nicholls, fresh from his trip to Estonia, and later, Gabriellus Landberghis, Lithuania's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and one of the most vocal on what is at stake in Ukraine for Europe and the West. But first, before the usual updates, our immediate reaction to Putin and Trump's call. Well, Dom, we've delayed the episode today because of that call. It's just ended. It lasted over 2 hours, so longer considerably than last time. We're getting the first readouts now. Apparently, Putin's described the discussion as informative, frank, and very useful. That's coming from the Russian press, who are first out of the gates, as it were. He said, we're generally on the right track. A ceasefire with Ukraine is possible once agreements are reached. Both sides must find compromises. And then he goes on to talk about the root causes of the crisis and that Russia is ready to work on a memorandum with Ukraine, including a ceasefire. Now, as I say, we haven't had the readout yet from the White House, but it doesn't sound like there's been any major movement. But, well, let's see what Dom thinks. Dom, over to you. What is your immediate reaction from what we're getting from this? It's not quite as dramatic as some people were expecting.
Well, I don't think it's dramatic at all, Francis. And I don't think it says anything. It went on for over 2 hours, which gives the impression of a lot of activity and a lot of discussion and what have you, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was absolutely strung out, lots of back and forth through the translators from both sides, to be honest, wanting to give the impression that they're actually having a really lengthy, in-depth chat about all the issues. I mean, Putin's come out and said he's dangled the possible ceasefire, and with this quote, for a period of time, should relevant agreements be met. I mean, a more loaded and caveated statement, I think you'll struggle to find today. There's talk about the Istanbul negotiations resuming on Friday, but again, that's just to make you think, oh, there's progress, things are happening. I mean, there's nothing in this. He said that those talks, perhaps starting again, shows that things are, quote, on the right track. I mean, progress would show they're on the right track. This just activity. It's just noise. It's heat and light. It's not actually showing anything. All he's trying to do here is manage Trump. Russia's position is clear. Every time all these statements are caveated with but we have to acknowledge, or we have to remove, or we have to discuss the root causes of the conflict. It always goes back to the root causes of the conflict. He says Russia is ready to work with Kyiv on a memorandum as a prelude to a possible peace deal. Again, a very heavily caveated statement. Look, there's nothing from the continued violence in Ukraine today that suggests Russia is serious at all about showing any kind of goodwill towards the process, let alone to Ukraine. The question for me, is this enough to convince Donald Trump that he's still moving forward with Putin, that Putin is still an actor, a relevant actor here who's acting in good faith and trying to push the process forward against really difficult things. I mean, it's not that difficult. He organised a 3-day ceasefire. If you remember, actually a couple of weeks ago, a 36-hour ceasefire, just with 5 hours notice. Then he wanted that 4-day ceasefire to cover his Victory Day parade. So he can show goodwill. He can announce a ceasefire between now and Friday if these talks are going to resume in Istanbul. There's lots of things he can do to actually show progress. So this doesn't show anything of the sort to me. As I said, the question for me is whether Trump will buy it or whether Trump will decide that enough is enough and he's got to walk away, or would he look for a face-saving way out of this, which might possibly be some future date for a face-to-face meeting, just kicking the can down the road. So, as our American cousins like to say, I think this is a great big nothing burger. It's just designed to show action and activity and progress, and results show progress. Francis, there's been no results here, no progress whatsoever.
Well, I agree with you, Dom. And just on what you were saying there around the American position, I thought it was particularly concerning to hear JD Vance, Vice President, saying that Trump is going to tell Putin to stop the killing, or else America is eventually going to say, and I'm quoting here, "You know what? That was worth a try, but we're not going to do it anymore." So Trump's message is basically to Putin, make peace or we're walking away. But that's exactly what would be a favourable position for the Russians, the United States, that's out of the picture. So it's a win-win if that's the position the Americans are taking. It's a win-win for Putin at the moment. It's quite an extraordinary admission by JD Vance, that, but then it wouldn't really surprise us given the direction of travel recently, I would say. And as you say, Dom, I think now it's really going to be up for the Europeans to try and persuade Trump that he's being played again. But, well, we can't be optimistic about that either, can we? So it all speaks to what we were talking about yesterday and the day before and the day before that and the day before that, which is Europe really ultimately going to be willing to step up when push comes to shove? But as I say, we haven't yet heard from the White House, and it will be interesting to see whether there's any differences. There have sometimes been a few differences, but nothing too fundamental that's come out of that. But Dom, any final thoughts on any of this before we dive into the rest of the programme?
Yeah, we were told that the phone call Trump-Putin was going to be bookended with Trump speaking to Zelensky. So if that is now happening, and that might be why there's no statement yet from the White House, because you never know, Donald Trump might be speaking to Zelensky right now. If that is the case, then this is Zelensky's chance to really take the diplomatic initiative, as he did the other day by saying that he was going personally to Istanbul. If he now says, well, I'll go on Friday to Istanbul, Donald, or I'm going to announce a goodwill gesture of a ceasefire for 2 days. There are things he can do, Zelensky, at very low cost to him that would show willing and show that he's on the diplomatic front foot. And they don't actually, those two things, if he said, I'm going to have a ceasefire between now and Friday, or I'm going to have a ceasefire for the next 48 hours, or I will go personally to Istanbul again, Donald, to see if Putin turns up. Very low cost, very easy to commit to. But it just shows that he is trying to push things forward. So it'd be very interesting to see if Zelensky comes out with some kind of additional diplomatic move in the next few hours.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Dom. And we shall see. We shall see. But let's turn to the updates from the weekend now. In the aftermath of last week's failed peace talks in Turkey, Russia launched its largest drone assault of the war on Sunday, notably the day before Trump's scheduled call with Putin. Ukraine's Air Force reported that Russia deployed 273 drones, surpassing the previous record set back in February on the war's third anniversary. Of those, 36 out of 112 penetrated Ukrainian air defences. That is a statistical increase which support Moscow's strategy of improving its UAV capabilities, including higher flight, faster speeds, and more effective dive bombing. In Kyiv Oblast's Abukiv district, a residential building was destroyed, killing a 28-year-old woman. 3 others, a 61-year-old man, a 59-year-old woman, and a 4-year-old child, were injured and hospitalised. Elsewhere in the region, another apartment block was damaged and several garages burned. In Fastiv, a warehouse and a farm building were hit, and a fire broke out at a local hospital. Russian forces also shelled 7 settlements in Kharkiv Oblast using guided bombs and drones. No casualties were reported there, but in Kherson, 29 settlements were targeted, damaging an apartment block, private homes, a cellular tower, a gas pipeline, and multiple vehicles. 2 people were killed in that oblast and 13 injured after shelling hit a residential area and a truck carrying humanitarian aid on Saturday. Those followed Friday's strikes in Donetsk and Kherson that killed 3 people while talks were ongoing. Those happened after our broadcast. Now, Ukraine's intelligence service also claimed Russia intended to fire an intercontinental ballistic missile yesterday as an intimidation tactic, but that launch never materialised. Whether it was due to political hesitation, technical failure, simply a desire to threaten and never actually launch, or something else entirely remains unclear. But nonetheless, there were lots of reports around that on Friday, hence why I mention it again. Now, returning to drones specifically, the most lethal attack of the weekend came on Saturday in Sumy, where a drone strike on a bus killed 9 people and injured 4. Kyiv police condemned it as a cynical war crime. President Zelensky said a whole family, father, mother and daughter, were among the dead, calling it a deliberate killing of civilians. Sumy's regional administration echoed that charge, calling the strike another war crime by Russia, a deliberate strike on civilian transport that posed no threat. The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, echoed others in Europe when he said he was appalled by this particular attack mere hours after talks in Turkey. He added if Putin is serious about peace, Russia must agree to a full and immediate ceasefire, as Ukraine has done. Now, turning to the front lines, the most significant update is Russia's claim to have captured the village of Alexandropol in Donetsk, a region still seeing some of the war's heaviest fighting. No other major movements were reported, though as ever there is activity on almost all sectors of the front, and casualties on both sides remain high. Putin, meanwhile, struck a defiant tone, insisting that Russia has the strength and resource to finish what it started, in a speech he gave over the weekend. He again rejected calls for a 30-day ceasefire. He said, "We have strength and resources to bring what it started in 2022 to a logical conclusion with the result that Russia needs." He then reiterated that Russia's goal is to eliminate the causes that triggered the crisis and guarantee Russia's security. It's important not to forget that to eliminate those causes would mean dismantling Ukraine's sovereignty and stripping its army bare, and that's before one even gets into the territorial concerns. Not only that, of course, there's ample evidence that the so-called justifications for the invasion were just a smokescreen for more overt imperialist ambitions, but you all know that already. So let's turn to the political realm more specifically. It was also a hectic weekend. European leaders, notably Britain, France and Germany, scrambled to speak with Trump ahead of his call with Putin. Friedrich Merz was especially busy. He said that the Europeans and Americans are determined to work together in a targeted way to end the war. He said, "We've made some small steps forward in recent days. The parties to the conflict are talking to each other." But most significantly in the German context is a shift on energy policy. Germany has dropped its long-standing opposition to nuclear power, the first concrete sign of rapprochement with France under Berlin's new government. French and German officials confirmed Berlin will no longer obstruct efforts to treat nuclear power on par with renewables in EU legislation. That resolves that key dispute that's delayed bloc-wide energy decisions. Whilst it's not as far as saying Germany is going nuclear, it does mean that the continent will perhaps steer a little bit more towards that direction again, which would have ramifications given the debate around energy and the ramifications of the war on purchasing energy from Russia. Just to give you a sense of how significant this is, a German official has said this is a sea change policy shift. And the French are saying the Germans are telling us we will be very pragmatic on the issue of nuclear power. That is big. So the words there of a senior French diplomat. It's been a big weekend, as I say, for Mr. Merz, because he was also involved in smoothing over a diplomatic row between Italy's Giorgia Meloni and France's Emmanuel Macron. Now, I won't go into all of the details of this row, but basically Macron said that she was spreading disinformation about the summit that Joe was at in Albania last week. Merz had to intervene to try and calm things down. Macron had actually said the discussion is about a ceasefire. Let's avoid speculation about it being about troops on the ground. There's already enough of that coming from Russia. And while all that was going on, in Rome, President Zelensky was meeting Pope Leo XIV following his inaugural mass. Zelensky thanked him for his support for Ukraine and his clear voice in defence of a just and lasting peace. Last week, the Pope offered the Vatican as a venue for future peace talks after Putin rejected Zelensky's offer to meet in Turkey. Now, I should say that also at this mass, which is the first led by this US pontiff, it saw leaders from Germany to Peru, European leaders, faith leaders, but also significantly US Vice President JD Vance. And after the mass, Zelensky met privately with both him and Marco Rubio. The latter posted a rather upbeat photo and confirmed that the countries shared the goal of ending unnecessary bloodshed. And apparently a source said they were involved in conversations around the situation at the front, preparations for the call with Putin, and the possibility of sanctions against Russia. So whilst perhaps not a sea change diplomatic event, it does mark a considerably warmer one, I would say, compared to the one that we saw between the two back in February in the Oval Office. But just one last update before we bring in Dom. In a surprise result, pro-EU centrist Nicholls won Romania's presidential runoff on Sunday, defeating the ultranationalist George Simion, that frontrunner who'd raised fears about Romania's Western orientation and was seen as being more sympathetic to Putin. Now, Dan, the winner, is a 55-year-old mathematician and mayor of Bucharest. He secured 53% of the vote to Simion's 46%. It caps months of turmoil in the country after the original vote, you'll recall, was cancelled amid allegations of Russian interference. That crisis split the country and drew a lot of international scrutiny. A high turnout of nearly 65% appeared to tilt the result in Dan's favour after he received just 21% in the first round, so nearly half of Simion's total. It would appear, this is the speculation, voters were galvanised by concerns that Simion's victory would steer Romania away from NATO and the EU. Interestingly, Simion denounced Putin as a war criminal and a dictator over the weekend just before the vote, but clearly it wasn't enough. So an eventful few days, to put it mildly, and that's before we even hear about Dom spilling bear meat stroganoff over his suit in Estonia. So, Dom, let's turn to that now. I know you've got a lot of interviews to run over the course of this week, including later in this episode. But talk us through this major defence conference. What are the big takeaways for you?
Well, thanks, Francis. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I suppose loads of people. And the next person I'm going to be speaking to is my dry cleaner. Yeah, I did spill bear meat stroganoff all over my suit. Anyway, so this was the Lennart Meri conference in Tallinn over the weekend. Lennart Meri being a former president and actually before that foreign minister of Estonia, still loved widely by the public there, film director, writer. Anyway, it was stuffed full of politicians, security officials, defence, foreign ministers and leading analysts and think tankers, that kind of gang. As I said on Friday when I dialed in, the anticipated attendance by officials from Britain, France, Germany, it looked like it was going to be thin, and that indeed it was. There were some very bright people from France and Britain, but in terms of actual officials there, not a lot. There was one German politician, and the US had their ambassador to NATO there. So a big hitter, but not many others. It was interesting to see who did turn up and who didn't. But anyway, so where are we? Well, I thought there were a couple of quotes from the weekend that really sum up some of the issues we should be thinking about at the moment. There was one quote that said, Russia and Ukraine are both losing. It's just that Russia is losing more slowly, which I thought was a sophisticated way of explaining what we think is happening on the ground at the moment. Another one came from General Otto Eichelsheim. He's the head of the Netherlands Armed Forces. He was talking about Russian reconstitution timelines. He said this idea, a lot of people are saying it would take Russia 5 years to build up a force to be able to threaten NATO. He said that was far too long. He said Russia will be capable of at least giving us a dilemma. Obviously different from a mass incursion, but a dilemma within a year after they stop with a ceasefire or an agreement in Ukraine. So really focusing minds there, I think. And one other thing that stuck out for me, this quote, the world has become more nuclear curious because of the war in Ukraine. People really have seen that actually, what's the big guarantee around the world? Nuclear weapons, which is not where we particularly want to be at the start of the 21st century. Anyway, I've got a few sections to break down here. It's quite a lot of red meat, no stroganoff puns intended, so stick with me. But let's first of all take the negotiations. So that thing that happened in Istanbul last week, the makeup of the Russian delegation that was sent to Istanbul was said by Margus Sakna, who's the foreign minister for Estonia. He said that was a slap in the face for Donald Trump. We will possibly get an impression later on if that's how it was received in the White House. Now, I was speaking to Bob Dean. He's one of the leading Dutch think tankers, specialist in Eastern Europe, and he's an integral figure in this negotiation process. And he said we are currently in the talk about talks phase. Now, that is very welcome, as he said, but it's only stage one. And he said there's a very, very long way to go before any proper negotiations take place or any kind of meaningful interaction that's on a good faith basis. And clearly in this gap, there's a huge amount of room for a lot of mischief to be made by those wishing to do so over establishing narratives. That's fixing in the minds of the public, and especially Donald Trump, to be honest, any ideas about root causes of the conflict, who the impediment to peace is, and all this kind of stuff. Now, I've got a longer explanation about the respective positions vis-a-vis negotiations and the thinking about how to approach these negotiations by Ukraine, Russia, Donald Trump and China. I think I'll go through that either tomorrow or Wednesday because it is quite long. Anyway, on potential negotiations, the difficulty was underlined, I think, by the head of a European Foreign Intelligence Service. This was under Chatham House rules, so I'm not going to name the individual. But this person said, the Russians have played hockey a long time. We don't figure skate our way out of this, which is a rather neat way of saying it. Then when asked how anyone could convince Donald Trump that Putin really is playing him and try and shake Donald Trump out of this idea that Putin is a clearly committed negotiator, this head of the Foreign Service said, ask Trump to get his intelligence agencies to report how internal Kremlin discussions are going on the US administration. And I thought, that's very, how do you know? How do you know what internal Kremlin discussions are happening about the US administration? Anyway, that's quite good. And then Alexander Stubb, so he's the president of Finland. Do you remember? He's the guy who played golf with Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, got across a lot of points about the war and the framing from Russia. Also managed to sell America a load of ice-breaking ships while they were doing a round of golf. He said one of the most important points are going to be the sequencing of sanctions reduction. That's going to likely form a central part of any peace agreement, that whole business side, appealing to Donald Trump's, that the more business-oriented side of negotiations.
So that confirms what we were speculating about the pivot towards a more business-minded transactional approach because of, well, to placate Donald Trump.
Now, speaking of Donald Trump, the only real insight we got was from a Trump-leaning delegate, shall we say. And again, this was under Chatham House rules, so I'm not going to name the individual, but clearly this person he's not a member of the administration, I should say, but clearly a very ardent supporter of Donald Trump. He said that the US president is genuine in his drive for a ceasefire, although the question was left hanging whether or not that drive for a ceasefire was part of a process towards the end of the war completely and a means towards achieving justice and long-term security for Ukraine, or whether this was just because Donald Trump's interested in business deals and a potential Nobel Peace Prize. But on his attitude to Ukraine, this individual said that Donald Trump is not naive. He knows Putin is responsible for the war, and he, Donald Trump, continues to make excuses for Putin in order to pull him into the process closer. Like I said, I didn't particularly agree with all of these. The individual who is close to the administration, we should say. He also said the US administration feels there's been far too much overreaction and panic in Europe to Donald Trump's approach to the war, and they think there are a range of economic and political measures that they can levy on Russia if needed. This talk of, as we've mentioned a few times, is Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill going through the US system at the moment. That's seen as complementary to Trump's approach and his policy, as opposed to, as it's being described in some sectors, as in opposition to Donald Trump and a way of possibly forcing his hand, which is unlikely to work. But this was seen as complementary to Trump's approach and policy, as it would strengthen his hand in any negotiations.
Thanks, Tom. And I know there was a lot about the future of NATO as well. Where do you want to start on that?
Then on the next NATO summit, so that's the 24th, 25th next month, we had NATO Deputy Secretary General Radmila Shepard-Sinka. She said, quote, the world of 2% defence spending is gone. Now, they didn't say this was a done deal. There's still a few, the ink's not yet dry, but it's almost certainly going to be declared at next month's NATO summit that the spending pledge on defence is going to go up to 5%. Yep, 5%. Now, 3.5% on hard heavy metal, and then 1.5% on wider security, or what kept being referred to as defence-related spending. So, for example, some of the more northerly and eastern European countries were saying, well, how are you going to get your tanks towards any fight if Russia comes over the border? You're going to need to use our roads, our bridges, our rail network, so we need money to improve that. So that kind of the 1.5% on wider defence spending, it's a little bit fudgy potentially, because that could go into national infrastructure projects. So yeah, it all has a defence shade to it, but there's no denying that bit was fudgy, which is why they've split the two out, I think. 1.5% on wider defence spending and 3.5% on hard metal. So that's going to be very, very tricky for a lot of the alliance members, actually, I think, to meet 3.5%, let alone the wider 5%. And in terms of whether or not President Zelensky was going to be invited. Again, Markus Zahner, Estonia's foreign minister, he said a NATO summit without Zelensky is not a summit. Bearing in mind, President Zelensky has, in the last 3, he's been to all of them, 2 of them virtually and 1 of them in person. So this idea that he was not going to be invited, this suggestion last week that the US were pushing for Zelensky to be specifically not invited to The Hague next month, that's what Zahner was answering there. And in response to that, the US ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, he said, I fully expect Zelensky will be at The Hague. So I think that's probably inching towards at least a virtual appearance by Zelensky. Now, what else are we expecting from next month's NATO summit? US will withdraw troops from Europe. So that is almost a done deal. We're not expecting it to happen imminently. There might not even be an announcement at the NATO summit, but we're very, very much expecting, and Matthew Whitaker, US ambassador to NATO, said as much, that later this year, after the summit, for some form of US drawdown. However, Mr. Whitaker was very clear that the US still fully supports and buys into NATO. Now, you can take a view on, do these statements balance each other? But I'm just reporting what was said in the room. As Chief of Defence for the Estonia, General Andrus Merilo said, we are leaving challenging times and entering dangerous times. So a lot of focus on heavy metal. It was very clear that strategic choices have to be made. General Onno Eichelscheim, who's the head of the Netherlands Armed Forces, they were talking about strategic choices and what you can defend, what you can't defend. And he said, Amsterdam isn't important to me. I'm sorry if you're listening to this from Amsterdam, but he said, Amsterdam isn't important to me, so I'm not going to protect it. Rotterdam is important to me, so I'm going to protect that, as in the port in Rotterdam, making the point that you can't defend everything and choices have to be made. So, sorry if you're in Amsterdam.
Yes, apologies if you're listening in clogs in the Netherlands. No disrespect intended, of course.
Now, there was a lot of chat about Europe, in particular the EU and Ukraine's relationship with both. Firstly, on Europe more broadly, delegates in another Chatham House session said that we are probably in a post-American order or post-American century, however you want to define it, but certainly Europe is seen as old, tired, too precious, too patronising by much of the world, especially a lot of members in the global south. They said that in recent years, the number of complaints about Western double standards and disinterest from global south has increased. Now, that might be exacerbated by malign Russian or Chinese influence, but you can't hide the fact that there's something there upon which they are trying to amplify. We were told clear need for Europe to put more diplomatic effort into reaching out to the world more broadly. For example, Mr. Stubbs, the President of Finland, he said one of the biggest UN agencies is based in Nigeria. And he put it out to the audience, who can name it? And there's a lot of murmuring and looking at feet. And he said it's UN Women, the UN Women Agency based in Nigeria. Came as a surprise to many in the room, judging by all the sort of murmurs going around. Now, this idea that Europe just keeps banging on about values and human rights and doesn't apply the same interest or focus on issues of regional concern to many around the world got a fair hearing. One African official, who not in the room but cited by another delegate, was quoted as saying, China doesn't lecture us. Yeah, okay, fine. Check the small print on all those infrastructure deals of the Belt and Road Initiative, because I think you're tying yourself in for something quite long term there. But it was very interesting that came out. And then Susan Glasser, who's a journalist from The New Yorker, she said she had been to another conference recently and speaking to an Indian government official who said Europe has to grow out of the idea that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but that the world's problems are not Europe's problems. She said this really does show how Europe probably views itself and how the world views us. We're going on about, as I say, values and human rights and minority interest and all this kind of stuff. And then when the rest of the world say, hey, we could do with some help here and water's a bit of an issue and all the rest of it, global warming, Europe kind of goes, yeah, but you can think about these other things. It was an interesting dichotomy.
Interesting. And what about Brussels?
Then on to the EU. The root cause of some of the problems and some of the foot dragging, if you like, the EU was painted as a construct built for and in peacetime. So it's slow, it's bureaucratic, overly structural, doesn't have the mindset or the institutional agility, the DNA basically of a wartime organization. So it's struggling to answer the challenges of today. The never-ending discussion, for example, about Ukraine joining the EU is said to be sending a sign of weakness to Russia and shows institutional vulnerability, and also could lead to a generational cynicism and disengagement by the youth in Ukraine who are looking in their hour of need. And the EU is not coming up with solutions or really even making it clear which way they want to go regarding Ukrainian membership. Now, if the EU wants to be a security actor in the world, it's very clear, that came over, that it needs to act. We were talking about the Moldova elections. It's very possible that the pro-Western government there at the moment could lose, especially after the Russian effort at election interference and the malign influence of Russia, particularly in the east of Moldova. I was chatting to Mihai Popsoy, he's Moldova's deputy prime minister, who's also double hatting at the moment as Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he was telling me that Russia has just enough troops, not a huge number, but just enough troops and bases, including some very unstable ammunition stocks, he said, to be a nuisance. Not in and of themselves to massively undermine the country right now, but just to be enough of a nuisance and a foothold, if needed, for Russia to be able to reinforce in the future. Now, the message came over that the EU needs to make a choice here, and if it wants to try and help Moldova in its continued march view to the West and eventual EU membership, it could work harder on the delivery of certain infrastructure projects, which they're really forcing Moldova through the stocks and sticking to every coffin spit of the treaty, which is fine. But actually, if the bigger picture is that you could show benefit to the public here by delivery of some of these things, it might be in your interest, EU, just to water down some of your particularly intense requirements. Anyway, Bob Dean, the chap that I told you about, who's the big figure in negotiations, he said that there are currently 3 broad paths to EU membership for Ukraine. Number one, the sort of JFDI model, that just flipping do it, like Greece, just let them in. It's for the greater cause. It's a value-based decision. It just cuts out all the chaff and nonsense. Just get them in now, because that's a big statement. Number 2, there's the full technical compliance, i.e. the normal roadmap, long-term, subject to blackmail by neighbouring countries. We've just seen today this deal between Britain and the EU, how it was nearly held up. This potential access to a $150 billion defence fund nearly held up because of fishing quotas. The way the EU works is that there's always somebody who wants to try and eke out an issue of particular relevance to them by holding up the wider deal. So long-term compliance, or the full roadmap to get Ukraine into the EU, could easily be hijacked. And then number 3 is a sort of very European, which is probably why it'll work, a bit of a fudge, special treatment for Ukraine, phased integration, or get them in now with phased integration in some areas where they're not compliant over the following years. Problem with that is, would that be viewed as a second-class membership by Ukraine?
It's a good point.
Couple more, Francis. Coalition of the Willing. We spoke about that. That was discussed at length. It would seem that the multinational division of 20, 30, 40,000 European troops on rotation indefinitely is possible now. So defence analyst Michael Kaufman, he said it's well within the means today that Europe would be able to put that forward. Now, it wouldn't be a peacekeeping force. It wouldn't just be there to train Ukrainians. It wouldn't be used to replace Ukrainian forces at the front. It would need to be an anchor for wider European/NATO air power. And the point was made very strongly that we've got to be careful about terminology, because peacekeeping or reassurance or deterrence forces, they all have very different meanings, different force structures, different rules of engagement. So we've got to be really careful about what we mean. Now, this idea of a ground force of about 20,000 soldiers kept just west of the Dnieper River, for example, so not directly likely to cause a confrontation with Russia, would that be a deterrent, or would that actually be a humiliation for Europe? The idea was put forward that Sky Shield, just the air power aspect, Sky Shield, about 120-ish European NATO jets based outside of Ukraine, extending that air umbrella into Ukraine, is that not a better idea? Right, in answer to that, Jack Watling, I had him on the pod a few times from RUSI. He was very emphatic. He said, no. I spoke to him later on, actually. We've got an interview that's going to come out later this week. He said Sky Shield as an idea was dead. He said Sky Shield is just a political fantasy used by politicians who don't know what they're talking about or just want to mask inaction as initiative. He said it would be far too difficult to integrate just NATO jets with all the ground-based Ukrainian systems that are now in place. And then Michael Kaufman said, well, what would it do? These jets, they're just going to be flying around, burning holes in the sky, as he said, which European air forces are very good at. Now, the other point was that air power based just outside the country with no boots on the ground would be too easy to switch off, in their words. Let's imagine, how would European resolve shape up if there was a renewal in hostilities, for example? Would there still be a desire for this Sky Shield, or would it just stop flying? Now, that would be denied, of course, but it would be in the back of everyone's minds, Ukrainian, Russian, everyone else's, in which case, would this idea of Sky Shield, would it assure Ukrainians? Would it deter the Russians? Probably not. So a ground force, which is literally putting people in harm's way so they can not so easily be removed, that would be seen as much more credible. And as I said earlier, that could be the sort of docking point for any future NATO air power. So it's looking like the idea of Sky Shield is going away and the idea of a ground force is coming back into fashion. When asked about this potential US backstop, i.e. would the US be there to back up the Europeans if need be, and as the Europeans were then backing up the Ukrainians if push came to shove, the comment was it's sometimes better to remain ambiguous. Don't ask the question if the short-term answer is going to be a firm no from the Americans. Interesting point. In terms of the timing of any deployment of this coalition of the willing, would it be before, during or after a ceasefire? Of course, all those options have risks and opportunities. They are all political acts. So who's driving the politics? Is it Europe? Why not just act now to show the US resolve, show Ukrainians and Russians resolve? The fact that they are still dragging their feet on this is just showing the US are literally calling the shots, even when they said they've got no interest in providing heavy metal forces. So the question left hanging over the conference was, why aren't you being firmer on this? Why aren't you taking a position? Why aren't you explaining all these points to the public and doing something about it? Why hasn't the concept of a coalition of the willing been progressed any further? The idea was put forward that everyone who is willing to fight Russians alongside Ukraine is already doing it. Volunteers, special forces, and so on. Not my words, this was a view from one of the delegates. They said, it's a fudge to say you're going to send troops, but you have to wait for parliamentary approval. It sounds, if not weak, then less strong than saying you're just going to do it. Now, there may be constitutional reasons for needing to go via your national parliaments, but again, leaders could be much firmer. They could, for example, say, I'm going to invest time and political capital in seeing such a vote through, but just saying, we're going to commit troops, ... Obviously, once we get it through Parliament, none of it sends a really strong message to Russia and Ukraine. So just some key takeaways for me. There'll be some interviews today. I think we're starting today and then throughout the week, and some more points that I'll be talking through throughout the week. But the key takeaways for me was that, number one, there's going to be no move on a ceasefire or any negotiations until Putin and Trump meet. Caveat, unless today's phone call actually provides some kind of breakthrough. But at the moment, it's with Trump and Putin. It's at that level. The Europeans really don't seem to be driving anything right now. Next one, the US will lower troop presence in Europe, starting possibly as early as this summer. And then that will lead to the next point, which is Europe's priority right now should be to act to replace or improve US commitments to Ukraine. That would show leadership, it would show credibility, it would show the burden sharing that the US are after, that Donald Trump is after, as the US looks further to the east. Next one for me was that NATO 5% spending target, 3.5% on heavy metal, 1.5% on wider defence spending. That's going to absolutely set the cat amongst the pigeons next month. And then finally, it was very clear the transatlantic connection between Europe and the US has to remain strong. So don't expect any major break with Trump from the Europeans. Alexander Stubb, president of Finland, he said, we have to keep engaging with the US administration. He was given not a lot of stick. There were loads of jokes about playing golf and all that kind of stuff, but he was making the point, look, it's our biggest defense partner. You can't turn your back on the US. So no matter what, in some other areas, you might look at your shoes, hold your nose or what have you. But he said, we've got to stay close to Trump. And that was the message. So plenty of other stuff, Francis, but I better take a break there so we can all have a little break from the diet of red meat.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from the Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
And to end the episode, let's hear that interview with Gabriellus Landberghis, Lithuania's Minister of Foreign Affairs from December 2020 until November 2024. He has, as you'll all know, been a key voice throughout the entire conflict, and it's good to have him on the podcast for the first time now.
So I'm delighted to be joined by Gabriellus Landberghis, former Foreign Minister of Lithuania. Mr. Landberghis, thank you for talking to Ukraine the latest.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So we're here at the Lennart Meri conference in Tallinn, Estonia. It's Friday, but the big news this week, of course, has been these on-off talks in Istanbul between the Ukrainian delegation and Russians. What did you think of the Russian approach to those supposed talks?
Well, I think that they are playing a game, and the game is being played not with anybody else, but with Donald Trump. They want to keep him engaged under Russian terms. So basically tell him a story that he would believe and continue being somewhat engaged, but more of on a Russian side. So for them, they see how fast Donald Trump is changing his opinion, right? Which, again, when he changes that, he leans again towards them. So it's fine for them. They don't need to commit to anything. First of all, it was asked for a ceasefire. Then there was no ceasefire, and Donald Trump was again quite all right with it. Then Putin was supposed to come to Istanbul, then he didn't come. Then Donald Trump again said that there is no problem with that. So they can continue doing that for a really long time.
Do you think we should have been surprised at their attitude this week? I think most observers would have expected that.
I'm absolutely not surprised what Russians are doing. My sense has been from the first days when a deal or pact was announced between Russians and Americans that something is happening, maybe behind the curtain, that it most likely will end up with a conversation between Putin and Trump. And I predict a rather bad outcome of it. Honestly, I don't see any good outcome. If Trump commits for a meeting with Putin, then Putin will have Trump in a very good position for him.
And do you think anybody is speaking to the US administration and to Donald Trump directly, saying that by insisting on that, when he says nothing's going to happen until I speak to Putin, blah, 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 he's absolutely reinforcing that Russian line, Putin's line, that Ukraine doesn't have sovereignty. It has no entity of its own, no agency. This is going to be great, big men sorting out the borders of Europe again. Why can't he see that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I'm calling it a pact, right? Because it resembles something that has happened in the 1930s rather than it should be happening now, when big men decided what to do with Czechoslovakia and decided that this will be the end of all wars in Europe. But unfortunately, that's never the case, because that was giving in to a dictator. Now it will be the same thing, right? And what I'm worried more is that I don't see Putin changing his tactics in any way. I mean, his requests for Ukrainians are still exactly the same as they have been in 2022. There is no rational approach to imperialistic mindset of Putin and his cronies. So this will continue, and my worry comes from that when Ukrainians have agency, they are able to say, look, we're not accepting this is utter BS. But when President Trump will sit down and he needs to come out with a deal, he cannot come out of meeting with Putin without a deal. So most likely he will accept what is being put out to him. And then you can imagine recognition of Crimea, which is a horrible idea even on itself, because that would spell out doom for any country that has borders with Russia. And actually, in the future, there could be more countries having borders with Russia if Russia doesn't stop. So that's number one. Demilitarization, removal of troops or from eastern flank for whole Europe. I mean, even if Trump has the idea of taking troops out of Europe, he can give that as a concession to Putin because he asked, right? And Putin will definitely ask for that.
Yeah. And do you think they are able to draw the parallel if they recognise, if there's de jure recognition of Russian quote-unquote ownership of Crimea, then China's going to say, great, well, let's have a go at Taiwan. Do you think they're able to join those dots?
It's very difficult to tell. I mean, most of the things that has happened in Europe with President Trump election, right, the way that he has treated Europe, for me, makes China stronger, right? Because the transatlantic partnership is one of the things that actually might have made some sort of an idea for China that, okay, if Europe imposes sanctions and if US uses its military power, we might not be in the best place to change the situation in the Taiwan Strait. Now, with everything that Trump is doing, for them, you see, it makes it so much easier, right? And you're absolutely right, with additional elements for proposals. And I think that China will start preparing for a deal with President Trump in a similar fashion that they would see now Putin doing, in order to change the situation, not via military means, but by just a signed document or even a common press conference.
And there's a number of analysts suggesting that actually President Xi might look at the situation now and decide that this is the best opportunity when there is confusion amongst allies, seeming a slightly wayward foreign policy from the United States. So this actually, rather than it being better prepared militarily in 10 years' time, with the chaos in the policy front at the moment, the next couple of years might be the time to have a go at Taiwan.
Exactly. The world has become extremely dangerous right now. And many analysts in the conference, they say about the same thing about Europe, right? That the most dangerous years, because of possible Russian escalation is not in 10 years, but actually now because of the whole thing. And same goes for China. So they have the disruption caused by Donald Trump himself, but they also have Europe extremely busy. And busier if US is withdrawing. So they have the partners divided, one of them focused, another one disruptive, and those who are under threat, basically they are unaware where to look. And what is worrying, I've read the latest report from Taiwan, where basically they are extremely disappointed, obviously, as many, about the US policies. And some of them are saying, okay, but maybe then some sort of a cooperation with China might be inevitable if we are unable to withstand ourselves. And if US is not here to help, then maybe we should change our mind, which then again changes the whole picture completely.
This is straight out of Sun Tzu, the art of war, defeating the enemy without a shot being fired, making the enemy decide it's not worth fighting.
Yeah, I mean, like the saying goes, don't stop the enemy when he's making mistakes.
Yeah. If I could return just briefly to the Istanbul talks this week, am I being too positive here, too optimistic if I say that because the Russian playbook was so templated, we knew what to expect and they didn't disappoint, that actually shows we can extrapolate and have an idea about what they might do next or how they're thinking. So is there an opportunity there to get ahead of their thinking and their narrative?
I think yes. I mean, the first cornerstone is that their ambition has not changed and it's not about to change. The only thing that changes their calculation is their ability to get victories on the battlefield. And if they are unsuccessful in that, if they have to pay increasingly higher price for any movement on the front, this is what might change Putin's calculations. And now, almost everything rests on Ukrainians. So my main calculation is, let's see how Ukrainians are doing. And if they're doing well, then it gives us hope, gives us time. Because that means that Putin needs to continue being focused on that front line. If Ukrainians are unable, which is also a possibility, this then spells a very, very big problem. But clearly, as I mentioned before, Putin will want to keep the United States engaged. I don't think that they will lose this enormous opportunity that has been presented to them. I don't think that they regard Europe still as a serious competitor. Basically, they don't like the sanctions, but they know that we're divided and slow, and so we are giving them enough time as they need. They need China. Clearly, it's unavoidable for them to cooperate in this stage of history. So I would predict continuous pressure on Ukraine. If there are successes, probably a new narratives that are being introduced about other countries in the neighborhood, maybe even start seeing signs of some pressure on the countries, like, for example, the one in Estonia, when for the first time a fighter jet was used in the operation against a tanker. So, I mean, Russia more aggressive, that is clearly in the cards.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about that incident this week. So this is a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker going through the Baltic Sea. Estonia sent out Coast Guard vessels to go and have a look and say what's going on, to which Russia replied with a jet to overfly and attempt to intimidate.
Yeah.
And Estonians reacted to that with aircraft of their own. So nothing eventually happened, but it was a flashpoint. There was a lot of metal in very close proximity. How concerned are you that seems to be increasing?
I mean, it's an escalation, right? So that was an incursion into a territory of Estonia, which is a new element that hasn't happened in the past. And also use of military, power in case of a rather civilian affair, when you have a civilian vessel stopping another civilian vessel which does not even fly Russian flag. And you use military force in order to intimidate. So that's new. My thinking is that the events have been leading to this because our inability to effectively respond to the so-called hybrid events in the region basically led Russia to believe that we're unable, we won't find an answer, NATO is not here, Americans are not here, nobody's going to react, so that means we can do that. I would really not exclude the possibility that we will see more of this and even greater escalation in the future.
Thank you. And just finally, so you're former Foreign Minister.
Yeah, I'm former.
You're clearly still interested in the defence, security, international political landscape. You're here at this conference.
Yeah.
Any plans for the future?
Now I'm thinking about more of an academic career. I'm consulting. I'm at the board of Munich Security Conference, giving speeches in conference. So I can say that there's a market for Eastern European politicians or ex-politicians to explain what's happening with Russia and the rest of Europe.
And all political ambition is dissolved?
No, I wouldn't say dissolved. I said that I'm taking a break. Still, I'm 43, so I still have some time left to decide my future.
Gabriellus Landberghis, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.